The moment my daughter-in-law called me useless, the entire room went silent. We were gathered around my dining table in Columbus, Ohio. My son Ethan stared down at his plate. Brittany crossed her arms and laughed. "Honestly, Phyllis, you don't even understand how things work anymore. You're just, useless. 40 years of building a family. 40 years of managing every dollar my late husband and I earned. And that was the word she chose. Useless. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I simply picked up my phone and pressed a button. Less than 60 seconds later, Brittany's smile disappeared when her own phone began lighting up with security alerts, one after another. And that was the moment she realized something she should have learned long ago. The woman she thought was powerless still controlled everything. If you've ever been underestimated by your own family, I'd love to hear your story. Before we continue, please take a moment to like and subscribe if stories like this speak to you. And in the comments, tell me how you would have reacted if someone called you useless in front of your family. Also, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. I'm always amazed to see how many people from around the world share these experiences. If you had asked me 10 years ago what my greatest accomplishment was, I wouldn't have said the house my husband and I paid off. I wouldn't have mentioned the retirement accounts, the investment portfolio, or the comfortable life we built from almost nothing. I would have said my family. For most of my life, that answer would have come without hesitation. My name is Phyllis Meyer. I'm 68 years old, and until recently, I believed the sacrifices I made for my family meant something. I grew up in a small town outside Dayton, Ohio. My parents weren't wealthy. We weren't poor, either. We were the kind of family that repaired things instead of replacing them and saved leftovers because wasting food felt almost sinful. My father taught me that every dollar had a purpose. My mother taught me that every person did too. Those lessons stayed with me long after I married Michael Meyer. Michael was 23 when I met him. He was handsome in a quiet way. Not flashy, not loud. Dependable, the kind of man who showed up early, worked late, and never forgot what mattered. We built our life together one careful step at a time. While Michael managed operations for a manufacturing company, I worked my way up in accounting. Numbers always made sense to me. People didn't always. Numbers followed rules. People followed emotions. Over the years, that skill became one of the greatest gifts I could offer my family. I handled budgets, taxes, savings, investments, college funds, retirement planning. Every major financial decision passed through my hands. Not because Michael couldn't do it, because he trusted me. And I took that trust seriously. By the time our son Ethan was born, we had become a true partnership. Michael earned. I managed. Together we built stability. The kind that doesn't happen overnight. The kind that takes decades. When Ethan was little, I never missed a school event. I packed lunches, helped with homework, stayed up through fevers, sat through endless soccer games in freezing weather. I was there for all of it. Like most mothers, I assumed he would remember. Not every detail, just the feeling, the knowledge that someone had always been in his corner. Ethan grew into a good young man, smart, hard-working, kind-hearted. At least he used to be. That realization still hurts. After college, he found a good job in Columbus. When he called to tell me he'd been promoted, I cried. When he bought his first car, I celebrated. And when he finally found someone he wanted to marry, I was genuinely happy for him. Back then, I thought Brittany Collins was a blessing. The first time Ethan brought her home, she carried flowers, not grocery store flowers. She had somehow learned my favorite were white lilies. I remember being impressed. Most young people barely asked questions about their future in-laws, but Brittany seemed different. She asked about my life, my career, my marriage. She listened carefully whenever I spoke. At the time, I interpreted that as kindness. Looking back now, I wonder if she was simply gathering information. But that's hindsight talking. At the beginning, she was everything a mother hopes to see in her son's future wife. She laughed easily, complimented everyone, made Ethan seem happier than I'd seen him in years. When they got engaged, I was thrilled. When they got married, I welcomed her into the family completely. I didn't treat her like a daughter-in-law. I treated her like a daughter. Maybe that was my first mistake. After Michael passed away 6 years ago, everything changed. Losing him felt like losing half of myself. 43 years of marriage doesn't disappear quietly. His coffee mug remained in the cabinet for months because I couldn't bear to move it. His jacket stayed hanging by the door. His voice still echoed through memories I visited almost daily. The grief was overwhelming. But life doesn't stop because your heart breaks. Bills still arrive. Taxes still need filing. Accounts still need managing. So I kept moving, one day at a time. Ethan and Brittany were supportive at first. They checked on me often, brought dinner, helped around the house. And for a while, I truly believed I was lucky. Very lucky. Not everyone gets that kind of support after losing a spouse. A year later, Ethan and Brittany decided to buy a larger home. The housing market was competitive. Interest rates were rising. Their savings weren't quite enough. They never directly asked me for help. At least not initially. Instead, Ethan came over one evening looking nervous. I knew that expression. It was the same face he'd worn when he was 16 and had dented my car. "Mom," he said carefully, "can I ask you something?" I already knew the answer. "How much do you need?" I asked. The relief on his face told me everything. I helped with the down payment, a substantial amount, enough to change their future. I didn't hesitate. Why would I? He was my son. The money wasn't more important than his happiness. Over the next few years, there were other occasions. A medical bill, a home repair, private school tuition for my granddaughter, unexpected expenses. I always helped when I could, not because they demanded it, because I wanted to. That's what family does. At least that's what I believed. Gradually, though, something began to shift. The gratitude faded. The requests became expectations. The conversations changed. Instead of asking how I was doing, discussions often centered around practical matters: money, property, investments, retirement. At first, I ignored the feeling. I told myself I was imagining things. I told myself grief had made me overly sensitive. But the feeling kept growing, especially after Brittany started taking a stronger interest in my finances. She would ask questions that seemed innocent, questions about insurance policies, questions about bank accounts, questions about investment performance, questions about estate planning. Whenever I looked uncomfortable, she'd smile. "Oh, I'm just trying to help. Mom, help." That word would come back again and again. At the time, I appreciated it. I thought she cared. I thought she was looking out for me. I had no idea those conversations were planting the seeds of something much darker. What I didn't realize was that while I still saw myself as the person protecting the family, someone else had already started viewing me as an obstacle. Not a mother, not a widow, not a person, an obstacle. And by the time I understood that truth, Brittany had already taken her first steps towards something she believed would eventually belong to her. She just didn't realize that I had spent my entire life paying attention to details. And details have a way of exposing people, no matter how carefully they hide. The strange thing about manipulation is that it rarely arrives wearing a villain's face. If Brittany had been rude from the beginning, I would have kept my distance. If she had acted entitled, suspicious, or dishonest, I would have noticed. But people like Brittany don't start by taking. They start by giving. Or at least appearing to. For the first few years after she married Ethan, she seemed like the daughter I never had. She called me almost every week, sometimes just to chat, sometimes to ask for a recipe, sometimes to tell me about a promotion at work or something funny my granddaughter had done. I enjoyed those calls. After Michael passed away, the house often felt too quiet. A 5-minute conversation could brighten an entire afternoon. And Brittany seemed to understand that. She always knew exactly what to say. "Mom, you're amazing. Mom, I don't know how you handled everything after losing Michael. Mom, Ethan and I are so lucky to have you." Little compliments, little reassurances, nothing dramatic, just enough to make me feel appreciated. At the time, I thought those words came from affection. Now I realize they may have come from strategy. The first sign should have been how interested she became in my finances. Not immediately, gradually, slowly enough that it didn't seem unusual. One afternoon, she came over while Ethan was at work. I was trying to figure out a problem with an online account. Technology had never been my favorite thing. I understood spreadsheets better than smartphones. Brittany laughed gently as she sat beside me. "Mom, you really need help with this stuff." I smiled. "Probably. Honestly, I'd be terrified trying to manage all these accounts by myself. It isn't that complicated." She looked surprised. "Maybe not for you." I remember feeling oddly proud. Managing finances had been my responsibility for decades. It was one of the things I was genuinely good at. Then Brittany leaned closer. "You know, if anything ever happened, Ethan wouldn't know where anything is." The comment seemed innocent, responsible even. I nodded. "That's true. You should probably organize everything." "I have." She tilted her head. "Really? Of course." That answer appeared to disappoint her slightly. At the time, I didn't understand why. A few weeks later, she brought it up again. Then again. Then again. Always from a different angle. Questions about my retirement accounts. Questions about investment statements. Questions about insurance documents. Questions about beneficiaries. Questions about estate planning. She framed everything as concern. Concern for me. Concern for Ethan. Concern for the grandchildren. And because I trusted her, I answered more than I probably should have. Not account numbers, not passwords, just general information. Enough for her to understand that Michael and I had been careful planners. Enough for her to realize there was more money than most people assumed. One evening, She was helping me update some information on my laptop. I remember becoming frustrated with a security setting. The screen kept asking for verification codes. Brittany took over. Here, let me fix it. Within minutes, she had solved the problem. I was grateful. You're a lifesaver. She smiled. That's what daughters are for. That sentence touched me more than she probably knew. After losing Michael, there were moments when loneliness crept into unexpected places. Having someone call me Mom still felt comforting. It made me feel needed, connected, part of something. So when Brittany occasionally offered to help with technology, I accepted. When she suggested creating shared folders for important documents, I agreed. When she recommended digital backups for financial records, I listened. Everything sounded reasonable, practical, responsible. The problem wasn't any single request. The problem was the pattern. A pattern I failed to recognize. Over time, Brittany became the person everyone relied on for anything involving technology. Family photos, ask Brittany. School forms, ask Brittany. Travel reservations, ask Brittany. Online accounts, ask Brittany. She positioned herself at the center of information flow, and nobody questioned it, least of all me. Meanwhile, Ethan seemed happier than ever. Or perhaps happier is the wrong word. More dependent. That's probably more accurate. The confident young man I had raised gradually stopped making decisions without consulting his wife. At first, I thought that was normal. Marriage is partnership, compromise, teamwork. But eventually I noticed something troubling. Whenever Ethan and I disagreed about something minor, Brittany somehow became the final authority. Not through arguments, not through demands, through influence. She had a remarkable ability to make her opinions sound like common sense, and anyone who disagreed sounded unreasonable. Including me. One Thanksgiving, I suggested the family create a savings plan for future college expenses. Nothing dramatic, just responsible planning. Before Ethan could answer, Brittany laughed. Oh, Phyllis worries about everything. Everyone chuckled. Even Ethan. It wasn't cruel. Not yet. But it was the first time I noticed my opinion being treated like a relic from another generation. Something outdated. Something old-fashioned. Something to smile politely at before ignoring. The feeling lingered. Months later, I attended one of my granddaughter's school events. While standing near the refreshments table, I overheard Brittany talking with another parent. She didn't know I was nearby. The conversation wasn't particularly shocking, at least not then. But I remember one sentence clearly. Eventually we'll have to simplify a lot of things for Ethan's mom. The other woman asked what she meant. Brittany laughed. You know how older people are. Older people. Not Phyllis. Not Mom. Older people. The phrase bothered me. I couldn't explain why. Maybe because it sounded dismissive. Maybe because it reduced an entire life to an age category. Or maybe because something in her tone felt wrong. I brushed the feeling aside. Again, looking back, I spent a lot of time brushing feelings aside. Probably because I didn't want to believe what was happening. Trust has a strange effect on perception. When you love someone, you naturally search for innocent explanations. You assume good intentions. You give second chances before first offenses are even proven. That's exactly what I did. Then came the day Brittany asked a question that changed everything. It happened during lunch at a small cafe near my house. We had spent an hour talking about family, vacations, and the grandchildren. Then she casually asked, "Mom, have you ever thought about what would happen to everything if you became sick?" I paused. "What do you mean?" "You know, if you couldn't manage your finances yourself." The question felt oddly specific. "I have plans in place." She nodded. "But Ethan would take over, right?" There it was again. Not concern, not curiosity. Something else, something harder, more focused. I smiled politely. "Everything is already handled." She studied my face, trying to read me, trying to determine how much I was willing to reveal. When she realized she wasn't getting more information, she changed the subject. But something had shifted. For the first time, I left one of our conversations feeling uneasy. Not frightened, just uneasy. Like hearing a distant thunderstorm. You don't know if it's moving closer. You don't know if it'll ever reach you. But you know the weather has changed. What I didn't realize was that the storm had already begun. And while I still saw Brittany as family, she had started looking at my life through a very different lens. Not as a daughter, not as someone who loved me, but as someone calculating what might one day become hers. And soon, those calculations would become impossible for me to ignore. The first suspicious charge appeared on a Tuesday morning. If there's one thing you should know about me, it's that I review my financial statements regularly. Not because I'm obsessed with money, because I spent 40 years managing it. Habits like that don't disappear when you retire. Every month, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and reviewed every account. Checking account, savings account, investment accounts, credit card statements, property records, everything. Most months, it took less than an hour. That Tuesday was different. I was reviewing one of my credit card statements when I noticed a charge for nearly $3,000 at a luxury furniture store. I frowned. The name didn't sound familiar. I looked closer. The charge had occurred 3 weeks earlier. I was certain I hadn't purchased furniture, especially not expensive furniture. At first, I assumed it was a mistake. Credit card errors happen, so I checked my records. Nothing. No receipt. No order confirmation. No delivery. The charge didn't belong to me. I called the company. After verifying my identity, the representative located the purchase. Then she gave me the delivery address. It wasn't my house. It was Ethan and Brittany's. I sat quietly for several seconds. "Ma'am," the representative asked, "I'm here. Would you like to dispute the charge?" I hesitated. No, not yet. Maybe there was an explanation. Maybe Ethan had accidentally used the wrong card. Maybe Brittany had intended to tell me. There were countless innocent possibilities. At least that's what I told myself. So instead of disputing the charge, I called Ethan. He answered on the third ring. "Hey, Mom." "Hi, sweetheart." We exchanged small talk for a few minutes. Then I brought it up. "There was a furniture purchase on one of my cards." A pause. "Oh, you know anything about it?" Another pause. Not long. Just long enough. "Actually, Brittany handled that." My stomach tightened. "Handled what?" "The furniture." "Using my card." "She said you knew." I stared out the kitchen window. "No. Ethan. I didn't." His voice immediately became uncomfortable. Maybe there was some misunderstanding. Maybe. "I'll talk to her." "Thank you." The conversation ended politely. But something felt wrong. That evening, Brittany called. Her tone was cheerful. Almost too cheerful. "Oh my goodness, Mom, I'm so sorry." "For what?" "The furniture." I waited. She continued. "I thought Ethan told you." "No." "Well, the card was already saved on an account from something we bought together a while ago." That was technically true. Years earlier, I had ordered a birthday gift online for one of the grandchildren. My payment information had been stored. "But why use it?" I asked. "Oh, we were going to reimburse you." "Going to?" Not did. Going to? A small difference. A very important one. "When?" Another brief silence. "As soon as we got around to it." The answer bothered me, not because of the money, because of the assumption that using my money first was acceptable. Still, I chose not to make it a bigger issue. I accepted her apology, or at least pretended to. After we hung up, I wrote down every detail. Date, amount, store. Explanation. A habit from my accounting career. Document everything. At the time, I wasn't collecting evidence. I was simply trying to organize my thoughts. A few weeks later, I discovered another charge, then another, then another. None were enormous individually. A few $100s here, several hundred there. A vacation deposit, a hotel reservation, home improvement supplies. Each time, there was an explanation. Each explanation sounded plausible. Each explanation left me slightly less comfortable. One Saturday afternoon, I visited Ethan's house for my granddaughter's birthday party. The moment I walked inside, I noticed the furniture. The same furniture connected to the original charge. It was beautiful, high-end, expensive, a complete redesign of their living room. Brittany noticed me looking. "Do you like it?" "It's very nice." She smiled proudly. We decided to upgrade. Upgrade. Interesting word. I remembered the credit card statement. I remembered the delivery address. I remembered her apology. Then I remembered something else. 3 months earlier, Ethan had told me money was tight. Apparently things had improved. Or perhaps they had improved using someone else's resources. Throughout the party, I paid closer attention than usual. I noticed designer handbags, new jewelry, luxury kitchen appliances, things that hadn't been there before, things that cost money, a lot of money. At one point, my friend Grace Turner pulled me aside. Grace and I had known each other for nearly 30 years. She was one of the few people who could read my face immediately. "You seem distracted." I forced a smile. "I'm fine." "Phyllis." That single word carried decades of friendship. I sighed. Maybe I'm imagining things. Imagining what? I explained the furniture charge, the reimbursements that never seemed to happen, the growing feeling that something wasn't right. Grace listened carefully. Then she asked a question I wasn't prepared for. "Do you trust Brittany?" The answer should have been easy. Instead, I hesitated. That hesitation frightened me, because deep down, I already knew something had changed. "I want to trust her," I said. Grace nodded slowly. "That's not what I asked." I looked away. The truth sat heavily in my chest. No. I didn't trust her completely anymore. Not after the furniture. Not after the unexplained charges. Not after the increasingly personal questions about my finances. Grace squeezed my hand. "Then start paying attention. Simple advice and powerful advice. I followed it. Over the next several weeks, I became more observant, not confrontational. Observant. I reviewed every statement carefully. I organized records. I compared dates. I tracked transactions. Patterns began emerging. Certain purchases coincided with conversations Brittany had recently had with me. Certain charges appeared after she gained access to specific accounts or online systems. Nothing definitive. Nothing illegal. Not yet, but enough to make me uncomfortable. Then came the transaction that truly alarmed me. It appeared on a quiet Thursday evening. I was reviewing an account connected to one of my investment properties. Most people didn't even know the account existed. It handled expenses for a small vacation cabin Michael and I had purchased years earlier. A place full of memories. Fishing trips. Summer weekends. Family holidays. I noticed an inquiry. Not a completed transaction, an inquiry. Someone had requested information about ownership documentation. I stared at the screen. Why would anyone need ownership documents? I hadn't requested them. Robert Langford hadn't requested them. No one had. Unless someone was considering a transfer or a sale. A chill moved through me. For the first time, the situation stopped feeling like carelessness. It stopped feeling like misunderstandings. It started feeling deliberate, calculated, intentional. I immediately printed the records. Then I placed them in a folder. A folder that was slowly becoming thicker every week. That night, I barely slept. Because for the first time, I found myself asking a question I never wanted to ask. Not whether Brittany was taking advantage of me. Not whether Ethan knew, but how far they were willing to go. And I had a feeling the answer was something I wasn't going to like. By the time my 68th birthday arrived, I was carrying a weight I couldn't quite explain. From the outside, everything looked normal. I still lived in the same house Michael and I had shared for decades. Ethan still called occasionally. Brittany still referred to me as Mom. The grandchildren still hugged me when they saw me. Anyone looking at my life would have assumed I was surrounded by love. But something had changed beneath the surface. Trust, once cracked, never feels quite the same, even when nobody acknowledges the crack. My birthday fell on a Saturday that year. A week earlier, Ethan called to tell me they were planning a family dinner. I was genuinely touched. For all my concerns about Brittany, I still hoped I was wrong. I still wanted to believe we were simply going through a rough patch. Families have misunderstandings. People get busy. Life becomes complicated. I told myself that perhaps this celebration would remind me of what truly mattered. Perhaps I was worrying too much. Perhaps I had become suspicious because I was lonely. The morning of the dinner, I woke up feeling unexpectedly hopeful. I spent extra time getting ready. Nothing fancy. A nice navy blue blouse. A pair of pearl earrings Michael had given me years ago. A touch of makeup. As I looked into the mirror, I thought about how much had changed since he died. Some days, I still reached for the other side of the bed. Some days, I still expected to hear his footsteps coming through the front door. Grief softens over time, but it never completely disappears. I remember touching one of the pearls and whispering softly, "I wish you were here." Then I smiled at my reflection and left for Ethan's house. The gathering was larger than I expected. Several relatives had been invited, a few neighbors, some family friends. The house was full of conversation and laughter. At first, Everything seemed pleasant. People greeted me warmly. The grandchildren ran to hug me. Lauren Parker, Ethan's cousin, gave me flowers. For a while, I relaxed. Maybe tonight would be different. Maybe I had been imagining things. Then Brittany took control of the room, not dramatically, subtly, the way she always did. Every conversation somehow shifted toward her. Her work, her plans, her opinions, her accomplishments. When relatives asked me questions, Brittany often answered before I could. At first, I thought it was accidental. Then it happened again, and again, and again. One aunt asked how retirement was treating me. Before I could respond, Brittany laughed. "Oh, Phyllis has become a professional relaxer." Everyone chuckled politely. I forced a smile. A few minutes later, someone asked about a recent trip I had taken with my friend Grace. Again, Brittany interrupted. "Oh, she's always finding ways to stay busy." Another laugh. Another interruption. Another moment where I felt strangely invisible. I tried not to let it bother me. After all, it was just conversation. But eventually those small moments began piling up, like pebbles filling a bucket, each one insignificant, together becoming heavy. Dinner was served around 6. Everyone gathered around a long dining table. As I looked around the room, I felt a wave of gratitude. Despite everything, this was still my family, or so I thought. The meal began pleasantly enough. Stories were exchanged. Children laughed. People discussed vacations and work projects. Then the conversation turned toward money. It started when Ethan mentioned rising expenses. "The kids' activities cost more every year," he said. Several people nodded. Lauren joked about inflation. Someone complained about property taxes. Then I made what I believed was an innocent comment. "That's why planning ahead matters." The table quieted slightly. I continued. "Michael and I always tried to save before spending. Nothing controversial. Nothing insulting. Just an observation." But Brittany immediately rolled her eyes. It happened so quickly that most people probably missed it. I didn't. "I knew we'd get financial advice eventually," she said. Several people laughed. Again, I smiled politely. "It's not advice, just experience." "Oh, come on." She leaned back in her chair. "You've been giving financial advice since the day I met you." The room grew awkward. Not hostile, just uncomfortable. I looked at Ethan. He stared at his plate. A familiar habit lately. Avoidance. I changed the subject. At least I tried. But Brittany wasn't finished. A few minutes later, she began talking about a kitchen renovation. A large renovation. Expensive. Far more expensive than what Ethan had previously described. The numbers immediately caught my attention. Years in accounting make certain calculations automatic. I couldn't help myself. "That seems like a significant expense." Brittany's smile tightened. "We can handle it." "I'm sure you can." "Then why are you worried?" The question surprised me. I wasn't worried. "You always sound worried." A few relatives exchanged glances. The atmosphere shifted noticeably. I felt heat rising in my face. Not from anger, from embarrassment. Because I could see what was happening, and nobody was stopping it. I chose my words carefully. I only meant that large expenses deserve careful planning. Brittany laughed. Not kindly. The sound sliced through the room. "There it is again. There what is. The lecture. I blinked. Lecture. Everything becomes a lesson with you. Silence settled over the table. The kind of silence people create when they don't want involvement. Nobody defended me. Nobody challenged her. Everyone simply waited, watching. I suddenly felt very old, not because of my age, because of the way I was being treated, as though my life experience had become an inconvenience, as though decades of wisdom had transformed into background noise. The conversation moved on eventually, at least outwardly, but something inside me shifted. A realization, painful, clear. I wasn't imagining the change anymore. It was real, and it wasn't happening by accident. As dessert was served, I found myself remembering earlier birthdays. Birthdays when Michael sat beside me. Birthdays when Ethan was young. Birthdays when family gatherings felt warm rather than strategic. I missed those days more than I can explain. Not because life was perfect, because love felt simpler, more genuine, less conditional. Toward the end of the evening, I stepped outside onto the back patio for a few minutes of fresh air. The autumn air was cool. The sky was dark. I stood alone, listening to distant traffic, trying to settle my emotions. A moment later, Lauren joined me. She handed me a cup of coffee. "You okay?" I smiled. "I'm fine." She gave me a look that suggested she didn't believe me. "You don't have to pretend with me." I stared into the darkness. Then I asked a question I wasn't sure I wanted answered. "Was it always like this?" Lauren hesitated. "Like what?" "The way Brittany talks to me." Another pause. Longer this time. Too long. That silence told me more than any answer could have. Finally, she sighed. "Honestly," I nodded. "Sometimes I think she forgets who she's talking to." The words stung, because they confirmed what I already knew. People had noticed. They simply hadn't said anything. Lauren squeezed my shoulder. "You deserve more respect than that." I thanked her, but her words stayed with me long after the party ended, because respect was exactly what seemed to be disappearing. Not all at once, not dramatically, piece by piece, and somewhere deep inside, I had a growing feeling that the worst was still ahead. I just didn't know how much worse things were about to become. A little over 2 weeks after my birthday, Brittany showed up at my house carrying a leather folder. At the time, I had no idea that a single afternoon would permanently change the way I viewed both my daughter-in-law and my son. It was a Wednesday, a quiet day. I had spent the morning organizing paperwork and tending to the flower beds Michael used to love. Around noon, my doorbell rang. When I opened the door, Brittany stood there smiling, not her usual social smile. A more focused one, purposeful. "Mom," she said cheerfully, "hope I'm not interrupting." Of course not. She stepped inside carrying the folder. Immediately, my instincts stirred, not because of anything obvious, because she looked prepared. Like someone arriving for a meeting rather than a visit. "Coffee?" I asked. "Sure." As I prepared 2 cups in the kitchen, Brittany sat at the table. The folder remained directly in front of her. Waiting, almost like a third person in the room. We exchanged small talk for a few minutes. The grandchildren, the weather, a neighbor who had recently moved away. Then Brittany finally placed her hand on the folder. "Actually, Mom, there's something I wanted to discuss." There it was. The reason she'd come. I sat across from her. What is it? She opened the folder. Several documents appeared, professional looking, neatly organized. Far more formal than anything we'd ever discussed before. What are these? Oh, nothing major. Whenever someone says that, it usually means the opposite. I reached for the papers. The first page mentioned financial authorization. The second referenced account management. The third discussed authority during periods of incapacity. I felt my stomach tighten. What exactly is this? Brittany's smile remained. It's just planning. Planning for what? You know. No, I don't. She leaned forward. If something ever happened to you, I stared at her. I'm perfectly healthy. Of course. Then why would I sign this? The smile faded slightly. Not completely. Just enough. It's practical. I continued reading. The more I read, the less comfortable I became. Some sections granted expanded access to financial information. Others appeared to increase decision-making authority. The language was complicated. Not impossible to understand, but complicated enough that many people would simply sign, especially if they trusted the person presenting it. I had spent decades reviewing contracts. I knew better. Who prepared these? Ethan and I discussed them. That wasn't what I asked. Who prepared them? Another pause. A friend. A friend. No lawyer's name. No official letterhead. No explanation. Just a friend. Warning bells began ringing loudly in my head. I continued reading. The more pages I turned, the clearer the pattern became. Each document increased Brittany's influence over my finances. Not immediately, conditionally, but significantly, far beyond what any reasonable person would require. I set the papers down. I'm not signing this. The change in her expression was immediate, not explosive, not dramatic. Just irritation. Raw irritation. The kind people reveal when they don't get what they expected. Why not? I want my attorney to review it. The answer seemed reasonable, because it was. Brittany clearly disagreed. That's unnecessary. No, it isn't. Mom, we're trying to help. There was that word again. Help. The same word that had accompanied nearly every uncomfortable conversation during the past few years. I folded my hands calmly. If it's legitimate, my attorney won't have any concerns. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Brittany exhaled sharply. A sign of frustration. Honestly, I don't understand why you're making this difficult. Difficult. Interesting choice. I hadn't accused anyone of wrongdoing. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't rejected the idea permanently. I had simply requested legal review. Yet somehow I was the problem. I think caution is reasonable. Her jaw tightened. Not everything is a financial audit, Phyllis. The use of my first name caught my attention. Normally, she called me Mom. Not today. Not anymore. Something about that small change made the entire conversation feel colder, more transactional. I looked down at the documents again, then back at her. What exactly are you hoping to accomplish? She laughed. A short laugh, an irritated laugh. We're trying to make things easier. Easier for who? The question hung in the air. Neither of us moved. Neither of us blinked. For the first time in years, I felt like I was seeing the real Brittany. Not the charming version. Not the helpful version. The version underneath. The version that appeared whenever she encountered resistance. Then came the moment I will never forget. She pushed her chair back slightly, crossed her arms, and looked directly at me. "Do you know what the problem is?" I said nothing. "You still think you're running everything." The words landed heavily. I felt a chill move through me. She continued, "Things have changed." "I know they have." "No, you don't." The tension in the room became almost physical. For years, countless small moments had accumulated. Interruptions, dismissals, questions, pressure, assumptions. Now all of it was surfacing, finally visible, finally impossible to ignore. I stood and carried the documents back toward her. "I'm not signing these." Her face hardened. "Why?" "Because I don't trust documents I haven't reviewed." That should have ended the conversation. Instead, something snapped inside her. Years of carefully managed politeness disappeared. The mask fell, and what emerged shocked me. She laughed, not kindly, not respectfully, cruelly. Then she said the words that would echo in my mind for weeks afterward. "You're useless now, Phyllis." The room became silent, completely silent. For a moment, I wasn't even sure I had heard correctly. "What?" She rolled her eyes. "You heard me?" I stared at her. 68 years old, a widow, a mother, a grandmother. A woman who had spent decades supporting the very family she had married into. And this younger woman sitting across from me had just called me useless. Not in anger, not in the heat of an argument, deliberately, as if stating a fact. The hurt hit harder than I expected, not because of the insult itself, because of what it revealed. People don't accidentally say things like that. Those words come from beliefs, from thoughts already living inside them, thoughts they've simply been hiding. I looked at Brittany carefully, really looked at her, and suddenly so many moments made sense. The interruptions, the dismissive comments, the questions about money, the pressure, the entitlement, the furniture, the unexplained charges, the inquiries into property records, everything. For years, she hadn't been seeing me as a person. She had been seeing me as an aging obstacle standing between her and something she wanted. My silence seemed to frustrate her even more. "What?" she asked. "Nothing." "That's it," I nodded. "That's it." She looked disappointed. Perhaps she expected tears. Perhaps she expected an argument. Perhaps she expected me to defend myself. Instead, I simply opened the front door. The message was clear. The conversation was over. She stood, gathered the folder, then stopped. For a brief moment, I thought she might apologize. Instead, she said, "Ethan agrees with me more than you think." Then she walked out. The front door closed behind her, and suddenly the house felt impossibly quiet. I stood there for a long time, unable to move, unable to think. One sentence kept replaying in my mind. "Ethan agrees with me more than you think." That hurt even more than the word useless. Because if it was true, then my problem wasn't only Brittany. It was my son. That evening, I sat alone at my kitchen table reviewing the documents again, this time more carefully. And as I examined every page, one terrifying realization emerged. The paperwork wasn't about helping me. It was about control. Control over assets, control over decisions, control over access. And if I had signed those papers without reading them carefully, I might have handed over far more power than I ever intended. For the first time, fear gave way to something else. Determination. Because now I knew two things with absolute certainty. First, Brittany had been hiding her true intentions. Second, I could no longer afford to ignore what was happening. The investigation I had quietly started was about to become much more serious. And neither Brittany nor Ethan had any idea how carefully I was about to examine every single thing they had done. The morning after Brittany called me useless, I woke up with a strange sense of clarity. Not peace, not relief, clarity. For months, I had been questioning my instincts, questioning my observations, questioning whether I was being overly sensitive. That uncertainty disappeared overnight. Because once someone reveals what they truly think of you, it's impossible to unhear it. The insult itself no longer occupied my thoughts. What haunted me was everything hidden behind it. The entitlement, the resentment, the assumption that my life, my work, and my assets were somehow obstacles to be managed. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Michael and I had planned our future. The same table where I had balanced budgets, paid bills, and helped build the financial foundation that now supported multiple generations. Then I opened my laptop. If Brittany wanted control, I needed to understand exactly how much access she already had. No more assumptions. No more hoping. Facts. I spent the first several hours reviewing every account I owned. Bank accounts, brokerage accounts, retirement funds, property records, insurance policies, investment statements, anything connected to my finances. The process was exhausting, but years of accounting had taught me one important lesson. The truth is usually hiding in details. Most people never look closely enough to find it. I did. The first thing I noticed was how many account notifications were no longer being sent directly to me. Several alerts had been redirected. Not completely removed. Redirected. A subtle difference. Enough that I could still technically access information. But not enough to ensure I always saw it first. I stared at the screen. I knew I hadn't made those changes, and I certainly hadn't authorized anyone else to do so. One by one, I began tracing the modifications, dates, times, devices, login histories. A pattern quickly emerged. Many changes had occurred during periods when Brittany had been helping me with technology. Helping. The word now sounded almost offensive. I printed every record, every timestamp, every notification change, every access log. Then I placed them inside the growing folder I had started weeks earlier. By lunchtime, the folder had become thick enough to require a binder clip. That wasn't a good sign. The second discovery was worse. Far worse. Several accounts listed backup contact information I didn't recognize. One phone number belonged to Brittany. Another email address appeared connected to one of her devices. I felt my stomach tighten. That wasn't an accident. Nobody accidentally becomes a backup contact across multiple financial platforms. Those changes required deliberate action, verification, confirmation, intent. I immediately began removing them, carefully, quietly, without notifying anyone. I wasn't ready for confrontation. Not yet. I wanted answers first. That afternoon, I called several financial institutions directly. Some conversations lasted only a few minutes. Others took nearly an hour. I verified account permissions, access levels, authorized users, linked devices, security settings. Most things remained intact, but each conversation revealed small pieces of a larger picture. Small pieces that fit together too neatly. By evening, I realized something unsettling. Brittany hadn't been acting impulsively. She had been preparing. Preparation implies planning. Planning implies goals, and I still didn't fully understand hers. The next day brought an even bigger shock. I was reviewing records connected to the vacation cabin Michael and I had purchased nearly 20 years earlier. The cabin sat beside a lake in northern Michigan. It wasn't our most valuable asset financially, but emotionally it was priceless. Michael loved that place. Our grandchildren learned to fish there. Family holidays happened there. Some of my happiest memories lived inside those walls. The property was held through a separate ownership structure. Simple, organized, secure. Or so I thought. As I reviewed recent activity, I noticed a document request, then another, then another. Each request involved ownership verification, property valuation, transfer information. My pulse quickened. Those weren't routine inquiries, not for a property that hadn't changed ownership in decades. Someone was gathering information. Someone was preparing for something. I called the management company. The representative reviewed recent records. Then she asked a question that made my blood run cold. "Are you still considering listing the property?" I nearly dropped the phone. "What?" "The person who contacted us mentioned potential future sale discussions." I sat frozen. "I never contacted you." Silence. Then confusion on the other end. Someone did. My heart began pounding. The representative couldn't provide every detail without formal documentation, but she confirmed enough. An inquiry had occurred. Questions had been asked. Information had been requested. Someone had been exploring the possibility of selling property they did not own. When the call ended, I sat motionless. For several minutes, I couldn't think, couldn't move, couldn't process. The vacation cabin wasn't just real estate. It was part of Michael's legacy. The idea that someone might be positioning themselves to sell it without my knowledge felt like a violation. Not just financially, personally, emotionally. I opened the binder again, added fresh notes, fresh dates, fresh evidence. Then I wrote something at the top of a clean sheet of paper. What is Brittany's end goal for the first time? I stopped asking whether something was wrong. Something was clearly wrong. Now the question was how far it went. That evening, Ethan called. The timing immediately felt suspicious. We exchanged small talk. Then he cleared his throat. "Mom." "Yes. Brittany said things got tense yesterday." "Of course she did." I remained calm. That's one way to describe it. Another pause. Then came the response I had been dreading. "You know she was only trying to help." The disappointment hit harder than I expected. Not because of what he said, because of how quickly he accepted her version of events, without asking mine, without questioning anything, without curiosity, just loyalty, automatic loyalty. I closed my eyes. "Ethan, did you read those documents?" Silence. A long silence. Too long. No. There it was. The answer. He hadn't even read them, yet he was defending them. Defending her. Defending something he didn't understand. A painful realization settled over me. The confident, independent young man I had raised was gone. At least for now. Somewhere along the way, he had stopped evaluating situations for himself. Instead, he simply trusted Brittany's conclusions, even when those conclusions involved his own mother. The conversation ended politely, but when I hung up, I felt older than I had the day before. Not because of age, because disappointment ages people, especially disappointment involving your children. That night, I couldn't sleep, so I returned to the binder, page after page, record after record, pattern after pattern. Then, shortly after midnight, I found something I had missed earlier, a saved authorization request. Incomplete, never finalized, but started. The request involved adding expanded permissions to an account connected to the cabin property. My hands began shaking. Someone had begun the process. Someone had explored gaining greater access. Someone had been closer to success than I realized. And suddenly the situation transformed from uncomfortable to dangerous. Not dangerous physically, dangerous financially, dangerous legally, dangerous emotionally. Because if I hadn't been paying attention, those permissions might already have been approved. I closed the binder slowly. For the first time, one truth became impossible to ignore. Brittany wasn't simply spending money. She wasn't merely taking advantage of generosity. She was building a pathway, step by step, permission by permission, account by account, towards something much larger. And if I wanted to stop her, I needed professional help. Not later. Now. The next morning, I picked up my phone and searched for a number I hadn't called in years. Robert Langford, the attorney Michael trusted more than anyone. The man who had helped build our estate plans. The man who understood every major financial decision my husband and I had ever made. As the phone rang, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Hope. Because for the first time, I wasn't going to face this alone. And I had a feeling Robert was about to confirm that my worst suspicions were only the beginning. Robert Langford answered on the second ring. Phyllis. The familiar voice immediately brought a sense of comfort. Robert wasn't just an attorney. He had been part of our lives for more than 30 years. He helped Michael and me create our wills. He handled business matters, property transfers, trust documents, retirement planning. Most importantly, he knew us. He understood how carefully Michael and I had built our future. Robert, I said. Something in my voice must have alerted him immediately. What's wrong? That simple question nearly broke me. Not because I wanted to cry, because it had been a long time since someone asked it and genuinely meant it. Can we meet? Of course. When? How soon do you need me? I looked at the binder sitting beside me. Today, there was no hesitation. My office, 2 o'clock. I'll be there. For the first time in weeks, I felt a small measure of relief. Someone with experience was finally going to look at what I had discovered, and if I was overreacting, Robert would tell me. But deep down, I already suspected he wouldn't. Robert's office occupied the second floor of a historic brick building downtown, the same building where Michael and I had attended countless meetings over the years. Walking through those doors felt strangely emotional. Every corner carried memories. Memories of plans, dreams, goals. A future Michael and I had spent decades creating. Robert greeted me personally. At 72, he had more gray hair than I remembered, but his sharp eyes remained unchanged. He ushered me into a conference room, then he noticed the binder. His expression became serious. That's a lot of paperwork. It keeps growing. I placed the binder on the table. For nearly 2 hours, I walked him through everything. The unusual charges, the furniture purchase, the redirected notifications, the property inquiries, the authorization documents, the backup contacts, the pressure to sign, and finally, the word useless. Robert listened without interrupting. Occasionally he took notes. Occasionally he asked questions. Mostly he listened. When I finished, silence filled the room. He leaned back in his chair, folded his hands, and stared at the ceiling for several moments. That worried me, because Robert wasn't easily surprised. Finally, he looked directly at me. "Phyllis." My stomach tightened. "Yes. What I'm about to say may be difficult to hear." I nodded. "I'm listening." He tapped the binder. "This isn't normal family conflict." I said nothing. He continued. "This appears to be a pattern." A pattern. The exact word I had been thinking for weeks. Robert opened several pages, then pointed toward various records. Individually, many of these actions could be explained away. That's what I kept telling myself. Exactly. He nodded. That's why people often miss situations like this. My pulse quickened. What situations? He chose his next words carefully. Potential financial exploitation? The room felt suddenly smaller. Even though I had suspected it, hearing someone else say it aloud was different. Much different. Robert wasn't emotional. He wasn't guessing. He was speaking from decades of legal experience. I stared at him. "You really think that's what's happening?" He paused, then answered honestly. "I think someone has been steadily increasing access to your financial life." I looked down. The evidence suddenly seemed impossible to ignore. Robert continued. "The charges concern me. The property inquiries concern me. The authorization documents concern me." He tapped one particular page. "But what concerns me most is the progression." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "This wasn't one decision." He pointed at the binder. "This appears to be a series of increasingly aggressive actions." The phrase struck me immediately. Increasingly aggressive. Because that was exactly what had happened. The questions had become more personal. The access had become broader. The requests had become larger. Each step slightly bigger than the previous one. Like testing boundaries. Seeing how much could be taken. Without resistance. Without consequences. Robert closed the binder. Then he asked something unexpected. "Do Ethan and Brittany know about the trust?" I blinked. "What trust?" A small smile appeared. The first smile of the afternoon. "Michael's trust?" For a moment I was confused. Then memories surfaced. Years ago, a private meeting. Documents Michael had insisted upon reviewing personally. My eyes widened. The reserve trust. Robert nodded. I hadn't thought about it in years. The trust had been established shortly before Michael retired. A separate legal structure designed to protect certain assets. Not because we distrusted anyone, because Michael believed every family needed safeguards. At the time, I thought he was being overly cautious. Now I wasn't so sure. "How much is in it?" I asked quietly. Robert opened a file, then slid it across the table. I stared at the numbers. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. The trust had grown far beyond what I remembered. Investments, real estate interests, income-generating assets, years of appreciation, years of careful management. A substantial portion of our wealth sat protected inside that structure. Hidden from public records, hidden from casual searches, hidden from almost everyone. including Ethan, including Brittany. A strange realization hit me. The assets Brittany seemed obsessed with weren't even the most valuable assets. She had been focusing on visible property, visible accounts, visible resources. Meanwhile, the largest piece remained completely out of reach. Protected. Michael's voice echoed in my memory. Hope for the best. Prepare for the worst. At the time, it had sounded pessimistic. Now it sounded wise. Very wise. Robert watched me absorb the information. Then he leaned forward. Phyllis, I need to ask something. Okay. Are you prepared to act? The question surprised me. What do you mean? He looked directly into my eyes. I don't mean emotionally. His voice remained calm. I mean legally. The distinction mattered, because part of me still hoped everything could somehow be explained, that Ethan would apologize, that Brittany would admit mistakes, that the family could heal. But another part of me understood reality. If I failed to protect myself now, the situation could worsen, significantly. I took a deep breath. What do you recommend? Robert opened a notepad, then began outlining a plan. Step 1. Do not confront Brittany. Not yet. Step 2. Document everything. Continue gathering evidence. Step 3. Review every account, every permission, every access point. Step 4. Quietly strengthen security without warning anyone. Step 5. Allow them to continue believing nothing had changed. I frowned. Why? His answer came immediately. Because people reveal more when they think they're succeeding. The statement lingered in the room. It made perfect sense. Brittany still believed she controlled the situation. If that confidence disappeared too early, she would become cautious, careful, harder to understand, harder to expose. Robert wasn't suggesting revenge. He was suggesting observation and preparation. Then he said something that stayed with me long after the meeting ended. Predators dislike obstacles. I felt uncomfortable hearing the word. Predators. It sounded harsh, extreme. Robert noticed my reaction. I'm not saying Brittany is a criminal. Then what are you saying? He leaned back. I'm saying she appears frustrated that you continue controlling assets she expected easier access to. That sentence landed heavily because it aligned perfectly with the documents. The pressure, the insults, the growing hostility. Perhaps Brittany wasn't angry because I was difficult. Perhaps she was angry because I wasn't surrendering control. For the first time, everything fit together. The meeting lasted another hour. When I finally left Robert's office, the sun was beginning to set. I sat in my car for several minutes, thinking, processing, remembering. The woman who had once called me Mom now looked very different in my mind, not because of a single insult, because of a pattern that had taken years to reveal itself. But the most important realization came as I started the engine. I wasn't powerless, not even close. In fact, for the first time since this nightmare began, I possessed something Brittany didn't realize existed. A strategy. And while she believed she was slowly taking control, Robert and I were about to make sure every step she took led her exactly where she didn't want to go. For the next 3 weeks, I became an actress. Not the kind who performs on a stage. The kind who smiles while carefully observing everyone around her. The kind who pretends nothing has changed. The kind who lets other people underestimate her. Robert's advice echoed constantly in my mind. People reveal more when they think they're succeeding. So I decided to give Brittany exactly what she expected. Compliance, at least on the surface. The first step was surprisingly difficult. I stopped arguing. Whenever Brittany offered advice, I nodded politely. Whenever she asked questions, I appeared relaxed. Whenever she brought up financial matters, I acted as though our previous confrontation had never happened. It felt unnatural, but it worked. Almost immediately, I noticed a difference. The tension disappeared. At least from her side. Brittany seemed relieved, confident, even cheerful, as though she believed our disagreement had been resolved, as though she believed I had finally accepted my role, the role of an aging woman who would eventually hand everything over. What she didn't realize was that every smile I offered came with preparation. Every conversation happened while another part of my mind remained focused on facts, evidence, protection. One Monday morning, I began implementing Robert's plan, quietly, carefully. Without attracting attention, the first task involved security. I changed passwords. Every password. Banking, investments, property management portals, insurance accounts, retirement systems, everything. Not all at once. That would have created suspicion. Instead, I spread the changes over several days. One account here, another there. Small adjustments, invisible adjustments. The second task involved access permissions. This process took longer, far longer. I discovered numerous places where Brittany's information had been added as a backup contact. Recovery email. Notification recipient. Secondary verification source. Individually, none seemed alarming. Together, they painted a disturbing picture. A picture of someone steadily positioning herself closer and closer to control. One by one, I removed those permissions. Then I replaced them. Some with my own information. Some with Robert's office. Others with entirely new security settings. Again, I moved slowly, patiently. The goal wasn't confrontation. The goal was protection. By the end of the week, dozens of small doors had quietly closed, and Brittany had no idea. The third part of the plan proved the most interesting. Documentation. Robert wanted records, not assumptions, not feelings, records. So I began preserving everything. Emails, texts, voicemails, screenshots, account logs, transaction histories, even casual conversations. Every evening, I sat at my kitchen table and organized new information. Sometimes I felt ridiculous, like a detective in a television show. Then I remembered the vacation property, the redirected notifications, the authorization documents, and the feeling disappeared. Because this wasn't paranoia. This was caution, necessary caution. One afternoon, Brittany called unexpectedly. Her voice sounded unusually friendly. "Mom, how are you doing?" "I'm fine. Just checking on you." Interesting. For weeks, she hadn't called simply to check on me. There was always a reason, a purpose, an agenda. This time felt different. Or perhaps it only seemed different because I was paying attention. After several minutes of small talk, she casually asked, "Have you had a chance to think about those documents?" There it was. The real reason. I almost smiled. Instead, I kept my voice neutral. A little. What do you think? I deliberately paused, long enough to create hope. I'm still considering them. The excitement in her voice was immediate. Really? Maybe. A dangerous word. Maybe. People often hear what they want to hear. Brittany certainly did. The rest of the conversation remained pleasant. When we hung up, I added another note to the binder. She is still focused on the documents. That detail mattered, because it confirmed something. The paperwork hadn't been a casual suggestion. It remained important to her. Very important. The following weekend provided another unexpected opportunity. Ethan invited me to dinner. Just the three of us. The invitation surprised me, especially after the confrontation. Part of me wondered if he wanted to discuss what had happened. Instead, the evening felt strangely normal, almost too normal. Brittany laughed. Ethan relaxed. The grandchildren played nearby. Anyone observing us would have assumed we were a perfectly happy family, and that was exactly why the evening felt unsettling. Because beneath every smile, I now saw calculations, questions, intentions. At one point, Ethan stepped away to help one of the children. For several minutes, Brittany and I sat alone. She sipped wine, then looked directly at me. You seem better. The comment caught me off guard. Better. Less stressed. I studied her carefully. What was she really asking? Then I understood. She wasn't asking about my emotional state. She was checking for resistance. Checking whether I remained suspicious. Checking whether the obstacle still existed. I smiled. I'm trying not to worry so much. The answer visibly pleased her. You should enjoy life. I plan to. The irony nearly made me laugh. Because for the first time in months, I actually was enjoying something. Not the situation, the progress. Every day that passed strengthened my position. Every day reduced hers. Without her knowledge, without her consent, without confrontation. A week later, another breakthrough arrived. One of the financial institutions I had contacted earlier returned additional account records. The package arrived by mail. Inside were detailed access logs spanning several years. I spent nearly 3 hours reviewing them. Near the end, I found something remarkable. Several login attempts had occurred from devices not belonging to me. That alone wasn't surprising, but the timing was. Many attempts occurred shortly after Brittany had conversations with me regarding specific accounts, specific assets, specific financial topics. The pattern repeated multiple times. Conversation, inquiry, login attempt. Conversation, inquiry, login attempt, again and again and again. I felt a chill run through me. The evidence still wasn't conclusive, but it was becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss. Someone had shown extraordinary interest in my financial life, far beyond normal family concern, far beyond ordinary curiosity. That evening I met Robert again. He reviewed the new information carefully, occasionally making notes, occasionally nodding. Finally, he closed the folder. She's becoming predictable. I frowned. What does that mean? It means people often repeat successful behavior. The statement intrigued me. Robert continued. If Brittany believes she's making progress, she'll continue using the same methods. And that's good. It's useful. I leaned forward. Why? A slight smile appeared. Because predictable people make mistakes. The sentence lingered in my thoughts long after the meeting ended. Predictable people make mistakes. Maybe Robert was right. Maybe Brittany's confidence would become her weakness. Because over the past few weeks, one thing had become obvious. She truly believed she was winning. She believed I trusted her again. She believed her access remained intact. She believed the future was unfolding according to her plans. What she didn't know was that the future had already changed. Quietly. Completely. And the first real test of that change was coming sooner than either of us expected. Because somewhere, somehow, Brittany was preparing for a major financial move. I could feel it. The pressure around the authorization documents, the questions about property, the increasing confidence. Everything pointed toward a larger objective. What I didn't yet know was when she would make her move, but I was beginning to suspect that day was very close. And when it arrived, she was going to discover that the doors she thought were open had already been locked. The collapse began on a rainy Thursday afternoon. Ironically, I wasn't even the one who triggered it. Brittany did. For weeks, Robert and I had been quietly reinforcing every barrier around my financial life. Passwords had changed. Access permissions had disappeared. Backup contacts had been removed. Verification methods had been updated. The process had been so gradual that Brittany never noticed. At least, not immediately. But eventually, every plan reaches a moment of impact. And that moment arrived when she tried to spend money that no longer belonged within her reach. I was sitting in my living room reading a novel when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Brittany. I almost didn't answer. Almost. But curiosity won. Hello? Silence. Not complete silence. Breathing. Fast breathing. Then Brittany spoke. Phyllis. The way she said my name instantly told me something was wrong. Very wrong. What happened? My card was declined. I remained quiet. And, another pause. Longer this time. I need you to fix it. Fix it. Interesting choice of words. Not, can you help me understand? Not, there may be a mistake. Fix it. As though correcting the situation was my responsibility. What exactly happened? I was making a purchase. A purchase. Yes. I waited. Eventually she continued. A furniture payment. Furniture. Again. Somehow that didn't surprise me. And the card was declined. Yes. What card? Another silence. Then came the answer. One she clearly didn't want to give. The account connected to your profile. There it was. Finally. Out in the open. Not hidden behind explanations. Not disguised as concern. Simple. Direct. The account connected to my profile. My account. I almost smiled. Instead, I kept my voice calm. That's strange. It isn't strange. Her tone sharpened. I've used it before. Exactly. That was the problem. For years, she had used it before. Far too often. Far too comfortably. I don't know what to tell you. Can you log in and check? I looked out the window. Rain slid slowly down the glass. Part of me wanted to confront her immediately, to expose everything. But Robert had been right. Patience creates opportunities. So I asked a simple question. Why were you using my account? The silence that followed was glorious. For the first time in years, Brittany had no prepared answer. No smooth explanation. No polished justification, just silence. Finally, she recovered. We've talked about this. No, I spoke gently. We really haven't. The irritation in her voice returned instantly. It's for family expenses. Which family? Another silence. I could practically hear her struggling, searching, calculating, trying to find the correct response. The conversation ended abruptly. She claimed she needed to call the bank. Then she hung up. I set my phone down. 5 minutes later, it rang again. This time it was Ethan. Of course it was. Brittany says something happened with the accounts. I leaned back. What exactly did she tell you? That she can't access them? Technically true. What accounts? Another pause. I don't know. That answer made me sad. Not angry, sad. Because Ethan seemed to spend so much of his life defending things he didn't fully understand. Then maybe you should ask her. The line went quiet. Mom. Yes. Did you change something? I considered the question carefully. Then I answered honestly. Yes. His exhale was immediate, frustrated, confused, maybe even worried. Why? Because someone has been trying to gain control of my financial life. Because your wife called me useless. Because property records were being investigated behind my back. Because I no longer trust either of you. All of those answers flashed through my mind. Instead, I said, because they're my accounts. Silence. Then, I don't understand. I believed him. That's what made everything worse. I genuinely believed he didn't understand. Not fully. Not yet. The conversation ended without resolution. But it wouldn't stay unresolved for long, because Brittany wasn't finished. Not even close. The next morning, she appeared at my front door, unannounced, angry. The moment I opened the door, I knew the performance was over. The friendly version of Brittany had vanished. What remained was frustration. Raw frustration. She stepped inside without being invited. Not a good sign. Why did you do it? I closed the door calmly. Do what you know exactly what. I'd rather hear you explain it. Her eyes narrowed. For a brief moment, I saw genuine hostility, not annoyance. Hostility. Then she laughed bitterly. You locked me out, finally. The truth, not concern, not confusion, ownership. She felt entitled to access she never should have had. I folded my arms. Those accounts belong to me. We've always used them. There it was again. Not you allowed us. Not you helped us. We used them. The language revealed everything. A sense of entitlement so complete she barely recognized it anymore. I looked directly into her eyes. Then spoke the sentence I had rehearsed countless times. Those accounts were never yours. The room became silent. The words landed exactly as I intended. No yelling. No insults. No accusations. Just truth. Simple truth. For several seconds, Brittany stared at me. Then something remarkable happened. Fear appeared. Only briefly. But I saw it. Because for the first time, she realized the rules had changed. The woman she believed was powerless had suddenly become unpredictable. And unpredictability frightened her, especially when money was involved. You're overreacting. No. You're making this personal. I almost laughed. Making it personal after being called useless, after months of manipulation, after property inquiries and unauthorized spending. No. I wasn't making it personal. It had always been personal. I simply wasn't ignoring it anymore. Brittany took a step closer. What exactly are you accusing me of? Interesting. I hadn't accused her of anything, not directly, yet she immediately jumped to defense. A guilty mind often does that. I didn't accuse you. Then why are you acting like this? I held her gaze, because I wanted her to feel uncomfortable, because uncomfortable people make mistakes. Finally, I answered, because I've been paying attention. The effect was immediate. Her confidence faltered, only slightly, but enough. She looked away first. That tiny detail told me everything. Then she did something unexpected. She changed tactics. The anger disappeared. Almost instantly, in its place, came tears, or at least the appearance of tears. I can't believe you treat family this way. There it was, the guilt strategy, the emotional weapon. Family, family, family. The same word people often use when they want access without accountability. I remained silent. She continued, "We've done so much for you." The statement stunned me. Not because it was completely false, and because it ignored everything that came before. The years, the support, the down payment, the tuition assistance, the emergency loans, the countless ways I had helped them. Suddenly, those contributions no longer existed. Only theirs mattered. Only their sacrifices counted. The imbalance was astonishing. Eventually, she left. Not because the conversation was finished, because she realized she wasn't winning. As her car disappeared down the street, my phone vibrated. A text from Robert. Just 4 words. Any reaction yet? I smiled. Then replied, "Yes, exactly as expected." Because something important had happened. Brittany's problem wasn't the money. Not really. The money was only the symptom. The real problem was loss of control. For years, she had been slowly gaining influence, slowly expanding access, slowly positioning herself closer to everything I owned. Now that process had stopped, abruptly, and people rarely react calmly when they lose something they already consider theirs. The frightening part, I had a growing feeling that this wasn't the end of her response. It was only the beginning. Because desperate people don't usually walk away quietly. And Brittany was becoming increasingly desperate. 3 days after Brittany lost access to my accounts, she decided to go on the offensive. Looking back, I think panic was beginning to replace confidence. For years, she had operated from a position of control. Now that control was slipping away. And people often reveal their true character when they realize they can no longer manipulate a situation. I received the invitation on a Sunday morning, not from Brittany directly, from Lauren Parker. My cousin-in-law sounded uncomfortable. "Phyllis, are you busy this afternoon?" "Not particularly." A pause. Then she sighed. "I think you should know Brittany is gathering family members." I frowned. "For what?" Another pause. The kind people make when they dislike delivering bad news. "Apparently she wants to discuss concerns about you." I nearly laughed. Concerns about me. The irony was almost impressive. "What kind of concerns?" Lauren hesitated. "She's telling people you're becoming confused." The room suddenly felt colder. Not angry. Cold. Because I immediately understood the significance. This wasn't about hurt feelings. This wasn't about a family disagreement. This was about credibility. If Brittany could convince people I was confused, forgetful, or mentally declining, then every concern I raised could be dismissed. Every accusation could be questioned. Every decision I made could be challenged. And suddenly those authorization documents from weeks earlier looked even more dangerous. I thanked Lauren for the warning. Then I hung up. A few minutes later, I called Robert. He wasn't surprised. Not even slightly. In fact, he said calmly, I was expecting something like this. That statement caught my attention. You were... Loss of access creates pressure. I sat at my kitchen table. Pressure. People respond differently when plans fail. I understood immediately. Brittany's plans had failed. Now she was adapting, searching for another path, another way to regain influence, another way to weaken my position. What should I do? Robert's answer came instantly. Attend. Attend. Absolutely. The confidence in his voice reassured me. Then he added, and I'll come with you. For the first time all day, I smiled. The gathering took place at Ethan and Brittany's house. When Robert and I arrived, nearly a dozen people were already there. Family members, close friends, a few relatives I hadn't seen in months. The atmosphere felt strange, uncomfortable, like everyone knew they were witnessing something they shouldn't be witnessing. Brittany stood near the center of the room. The moment she saw Robert walking beside me, her expression changed. Only briefly, but I noticed. Shock, then concern, then calculation. Clearly, she hadn't expected me to arrive with legal representation. Good. I wanted her uncomfortable. Ethan looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes, tension across his face. For a brief moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Then I remembered every opportunity he'd had to ask questions, every opportunity he'd had to listen, every opportunity he'd had to stand beside me. Instead, he had chosen silence, and silence has consequences. Brittany cleared her throat. Thank you all for coming. The room quieted. She smiled sadly. A performance already underway. We're here because we're worried about Phyllis. The acting was excellent. If I didn't know the truth, I might have believed her. She continued. Recently, she's been making unusual decisions. Robert remained silent beside me, observing, waiting. Brittany pressed forward. She's become suspicious. A few people shifted uncomfortably. She's withdrawn. More uncomfortable silence. And she's making financial choices that concern Ethan and me. There it was. The setup. The foundation she hoped would support her narrative. I watched family members glance toward me. Some looked confused. Others looked uncertain. Nobody looked convinced. That encouraged me. Then Brittany made her mistake. A big one. Honestly, we're worried she may not be capable of handling everything anymore. The words hung in the room. And suddenly I understood exactly how far she was willing to go. She wasn't simply attacking my decisions. She was attacking my competence, my independence, my credibility, everything. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Robert calmly stepped forward. May I ask a question? Brittany visibly stiffened. Of course, Robert smiled politely. Specifically, which decisions concern you? The question sounded harmless. It wasn't, because accusations are easy. Details are harder. Brittany hesitated, then recovered. Financial decisions, such as... Another pause. Longer this time. The account changes. Robert nodded. The accounts belonging to Phyllis. Yes. The accounts solely owned by Phyllis. Another pause. Yes. Robert smiled again. Interesting. The room grew noticeably quieter. People were paying attention now. Very close attention. Because suddenly the story wasn't sounding quite as simple. Brittany continued. We've always helped her. Robert nodded. I'm sure you have. Then he opened a folder. My folder. The room immediately changed. People sat straighter. Faces became serious. And for the first time that afternoon, Brittany looked nervous. Not irritated. Nervous. Robert removed several documents. Since we're discussing concerns, perhaps we should discuss facts. The silence became absolute. He began with the furniture purchase, transaction records, delivery confirmation, credit card statements, everything. No accusations, just documentation, just evidence. Then came the additional charges, then the account permissions, then the redirected notifications, then the property inquiries, one by one, methodically, calmly, professionally. As each document appeared, Brittany's confidence diminished. Her posture changed. Her breathing changed. Her expression changed. The performance was collapsing, and everyone in the room could see it. Then Lauren unexpectedly spoke. I knew something felt off. All eyes turned toward her. Lauren looked directly at Brittany. You remember what you told me last year. The color immediately drained from Brittany's face. That reaction alone was revealing. What are you talking about? Brittany asked. Lauren folded her arms. At the 4th of July party. No answer. You said it was only a matter of time before everything belonged to your family. The room went silent again. Even Ethan looked shocked. Lauren continued. You specifically said the Meyer assets would eventually be under your control. Brittany's mouth opened, then closed. No response. No explanation. No denial. Nothing. Because some truths arrive without warning, and when they do, lies struggle to keep up. The atmosphere shifted dramatically. Family members who had seemed uncertain earlier now looked disturbed, concerned, disappointed. Several people exchanged glances. Others stared at Brittany, waiting, expecting, hoping for an explanation. None came. Instead, Brittany became defensive. That's not what I meant. Lauren raised an eyebrow. Then what did you mean? No answer. The silence became devastating. Then Robert delivered the final blow. He calmly placed copies of the authorization documents on the table. The same documents Brittany had pressured me to sign. The same documents she claimed were harmless. Several relatives began reading. Expressions changed immediately. Confusion, concern, disbelief. One aunt actually removed her glasses and reread portions. Why would she need this much authority? She asked quietly. Nobody answered. Because nobody could. Not honestly. For the first time all afternoon, Brittany stood completely alone. The support she expected wasn't there. The sympathy she wanted wasn't there. The narrative she had carefully constructed was falling apart. Then something happened that surprised me. Ethan finally spoke. Not loudly. Not dramatically, but clearly. He looked at Brittany, then at the documents, then back at Brittany, and I watched realization begin spreading across his face. Slowly, painfully, like someone waking from a long sleep. What exactly were you trying to do? The question wasn't directed at me. It wasn't directed at Robert. It was directed at his wife. And judging by the fear in Brittany's eyes, She understood immediately that everything had changed. Because the one person who always believed her was finally beginning to ask questions. And once questions begin, the truth rarely stays hidden for long. The meeting at Ethan's house ended in silence. Not the peaceful kind, the kind that follows a truth nobody wanted to hear. One by one, relatives gathered their belongings and left. Some offered me quiet hugs. Others avoided eye contact entirely. Not because they blamed me. Because they felt uncomfortable witnessing a family fracture in real time. By the time Robert and I walked out the front door, dusk had settled over the neighborhood. I stood beside my car for a moment, exhausted, not physically, emotionally. The hardest part wasn't exposing Brittany. The hardest part was watching Ethan sit there, stunned, as pieces of his life collapsed around him. For years, I had imagined countless versions of this confrontation. In every version, I assumed my son would eventually understand. What I hadn't expected was how painful that understanding would be. 3 days passed before Ethan called. 3 long days. No texts. No explanations. No apologies. Just silence. Part of me welcomed it. I needed time to think, time to process, time to grieve the relationship I thought we had. When his name finally appeared on my phone, I stared at the screen for several seconds before answering. Hello? His voice sounded different, smaller somehow. Mom. I waited. No greeting, no small talk, just silence. Then a deep breath. Can I come over? I closed my eyes. For a moment, I considered saying no, not permanently, just for that day, because I wasn't sure I was ready. But another part of me remembered the little boy who used to run into my arms after school, the teenager who once stayed up all night helping Michael shovel snow after a storm, the young man who cried when his father died. I hadn't stopped loving him. I simply didn't trust him. Those are very different things. Come by around 6. Okay. His voice cracked slightly. Thank you. When Ethan arrived that evening, he looked exhausted, far worse than he had at the family gathering. His eyes were bloodshot. His shoulders slumped. His clothes looked wrinkled, like someone who hadn't slept much. I opened the door and stepped aside. Neither of us knew how to begin. So we sat at the kitchen table, the same table where he had done homework as a child, the same table where Michael had taught him how to balance a checkbook, the same table where countless family memories lived. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. I didn't know. The words hung in the air. I studied him carefully. Didn't know what? Most of it. Most of it. Not all of it. Most of it. That distinction mattered. A lot. I folded my hands. What did you know? His eyes dropped toward the table. The answer didn't come immediately. And that hesitation told me more than words ever could. Eventually, he spoke. I knew Brittany had access to some accounts. I nodded. What else? Another pause. Longer this time. I knew she'd been helping with financial stuff. Helping. That word again. Always helping. Always helping until the evidence suggested otherwise. What else? He swallowed hard. I knew she talked about your assets. The room felt colder. Not because I was surprised, because hearing him admit it made everything real. How often? His expression tightened. More than I should have allowed. I looked away. For years, I had protected him, defended him, made excuses for him. But now I was tired of excuses. What exactly did she say? Ethan rubbed his face. Sometimes she'd talk about inheritance. I felt my stomach sink. Sometimes she'd talk about simplifying things. The phrase immediately sounded familiar. Simplifying, the same language Brittany had used before. The same language people often use when discussing control. Not care. Control. I stared at him. And you never thought that was a problem? Pain flashed across his face. I didn't want to. There it was. The truth. Not ignorance. Avoidance. A very different thing. Ethan wasn't blind. He simply chose not to look. Because looking would have forced him to confront uncomfortable realities. And confronting those realities might have threatened his marriage. I leaned back in my chair. Suddenly I felt older than my 68 years. Not because of Brittany. Because of disappointment. Because disappointment ages people. Especially when it comes from your children. Why are you here, Ethan? The question surprised him. For a moment, he looked confused. Then his eyes filled with tears. Real tears. Not Brittany's carefully performed version. Real ones. I'm here because I failed you. The words landed heavily. And for the first time all evening, I believed every single one. He wasn't defending himself. He wasn't minimizing. He wasn't making excuses. He was finally telling the truth. I should have listened. I remained silent. I should have asked questions. Silence. I should have protected you. That one hurt the most, because protecting parents isn't supposed to be a child's primary responsibility, but respect is. And respect had been absent for a long time. Ethan wiped his eyes. Then he said something that shocked me. There was a loan. My heart skipped. A loan. He nodded slowly. I suddenly understood why Robert always emphasized patience. Because people eventually tell you things when they're ready. And Ethan was finally ready. Brittany convinced me it was temporary. My pulse quickened. What kind of loan? He looked miserable. A personal line of credit. How much? The number that followed made me close my eyes. Not because it would ruin him. Because it was large enough to matter. Large enough to create pressure. Large enough to explain some of Brittany's increasingly desperate behavior. Why? His answer came immediately. Debt. I opened my eyes. What debt? Another painful silence. Then, credit cards. I stared at him. Brittany's. He nodded. Again and again. As if admitting it physically hurt. Because maybe it did. The pieces suddenly began fitting together. The furniture. The vacations. The spending. The urgency. The property inquiries. The authorization documents. The pressure. The entitlement. It wasn't only greed. It was desperation. Financial desperation hidden beneath confidence. And suddenly Brittany's behavior became even more dangerous. Desperate people make reckless decisions. Very reckless decisions. Ethan continued, I thought I could fix it. The statement sounded heartbreakingly familiar. People say that right before disaster. I thought things would improve. I nodded slowly. Did they? No. His answer came instantly. No hesitation. No uncertainty. Just truth. The room fell quiet again. Eventually, Ethan looked directly at me. A rare thing lately. Do you hate me? The question nearly broke my heart. Because despite everything, he was still my son. A flawed son. A disappointing son. A weak son. But my son. No. His shoulders relaxed slightly. I don't hate you. The relief in his eyes was immediate. Then I continued. "But I don't trust you." The relief disappeared. And that was necessary, because trust and love are not the same thing. I loved him. I probably always would. Trust, however, must be earned. And he had spent years spending it carelessly. The conversation lasted another hour. By the time Ethan left, both of us looked emotionally drained. At the front door, he turned toward me. "I'm sorry, Mom." I believed him. For the first time in a very long time, I truly believed him. But belief wasn't enough. Not anymore, because apologies heal wounds. They don't automatically rebuild trust. As his car disappeared down the street, I stood quietly on the porch, watching, thinking, remembering. Then my phone vibrated. A message from Robert. Any updates? I stared at the screen for a moment, then typed 3 simple words. He's finally talking. Because after months of lies, manipulation, and silence, the truth was finally emerging. And what worried me most wasn't what Ethan had already revealed. It was what Brittany was still hiding. The truth has a strange way of changing people. Sometimes it makes them humble. Sometimes it makes them honest. And sometimes it makes them desperate. Unfortunately, Brittany chose desperation. 3 days after Ethan's visit, I received a call from Robert. His voice sounded calm, but I had known him long enough to hear the concern underneath. "Phyllis, I need you to come to my office." My stomach tightened immediately. What happened? I'd rather discuss it in person. That answer was never good. Not once in 30 years had those words preceded pleasant news. "I'll be there in an hour." When I arrived, Robert already had several documents spread across the conference table. The moment I saw them, I knew something significant had happened. "What is it?" He motioned for me to sit. Then he handed me a printed report. I scanned the first page. My pulse immediately accelerated. There had been another attempt. A serious one. Someone had tried to initiate access requests through a financial platform connected to one of my investment accounts. The request failed. But the record existed. The attempt existed. And unlike previous incidents, this one left a very clear digital trail. I looked up. Was it Brittany? Robert nodded slowly. The originating device matches previous records. For several moments, I simply stared at the paperwork. I wasn't shocked anymore. That phase had passed. What I felt now was disappointment. Deep disappointment. Because every new discovery removed another possible excuse, another possible misunderstanding, another possible innocent explanation. At some point, patterns stopped being coincidences. This pattern had stopped a long time ago. Robert folded his hands. "There's more." Those words immediately made me nervous. "What?" He slid another document across the table. This one involved public property records. I began reading, then stopped, then reread the page. My heart sank. Brittany had apparently spoken with a real estate professional. Not formally, not enough to create legal consequences, but enough to ask questions. Questions about property values. Questions about transfer procedures. Questions about ownership transitions after death. Questions about inheritance timelines. I slowly placed the paper down. The room felt very quiet. She was planning ahead. Robert nodded. That's my interpretation. Planning ahead. The phrase felt chilling. Not because discussing inheritance is inherently wrong. Families do it all the time. Because of the context. Because of the secrecy. Because of everything else. Because she wasn't asking how to protect my future. She was asking how to access it. A distinction that mattered enormously. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then Robert surprised me. "How are you feeling?" I laughed softly. A tired laugh. "That's actually a difficult question." He nodded. "I imagine it is." I looked down at the documents. "You know what's strange?" "What?" "I'm not angry anymore." That realization surprised even me. Months earlier, I would have been furious. Now mostly sad. Sad for Ethan. Sad for my grandchildren. Sad for the family we could have been. Robert listened quietly. Then I continued. "I think I've finally accepted reality. Acceptance. Not surrender. Not defeat. Acceptance. The difference is important. Acceptance means you stop fighting facts. You stop bargaining with them. You stop wishing reality was something else. You simply see it clearly. And clarity changes everything." That evening, I received another unexpected visitor, Ethan. This time, he looked even worse. He sat at my kitchen table in silence for several minutes before speaking. Finally, he said, "She's moving out." I stared at him. "What?" His eyes filled with pain. "She rented an apartment." The words landed heavily. Not because I hadn't expected problems, because I hadn't expected things to deteriorate so quickly. "What happened?" He laughed bitterly. A laugh with no happiness inside it. "Everything." I waited. Eventually, he began talking. And once he started, he didn't stop. The argument had begun after the family meeting. Questions, doubts, conversations. For the first time in years, Ethan had started challenging Brittany's explanations, demanding details, requesting honesty. Apparently she didn't respond well. The more questions he asked, the angrier she became. The angrier she became, the more mistakes she made. Eventually, financial records surfaced. Credit card balances, personal debts, hidden obligations, large hidden obligations, far larger than Ethan had known. Some stretched back years, meaning many of the financial pressures driving Brittany's behavior had existed long before the recent conflicts. She hadn't suddenly become desperate. She had been desperate for a very long time. She had simply hidden it well. I listened quietly. Then Ethan said something that made my heart ache. "I don't even know who I married." The sentence sounded painfully sincere, because sometimes betrayal isn't discovering someone lied. Sometimes betrayal is discovering how much they lied. The scale changes everything. I reached across the table and squeezed his hand. A simple gesture, nothing more. Because despite everything, he was hurting. And pain deserves compassion, even when mistakes contributed to it. We sat quietly for a moment. Then Ethan looked at me. "Do you think she ever loved me?" The question caught me off guard. I considered it carefully, because easy answers are rarely helpful. Finally, I spoke honestly. "I think she probably did." He blinked. "You do?" "Yes." The answer surprised him, maybe because it surprised me too. But life is rarely black and white. People are complicated, even flawed people, even selfish people, even manipulative people. "I think she loved you." I paused. "Just not enough to be honest with you." the truth visibly hurt. But it was still the truth, and sometimes truth hurts before it heals. A week later came the final confrontation. Not in a courtroom, not in a dramatic public setting. In Robert's office. Brittany requested the meeting herself. That fact alone told me how much had changed. Months earlier, she had acted from confidence. Now she was acting from damage control. When she entered the conference room, I barely recognized her. She looked exhausted. The confident smile was gone. The polished appearance remained. But the certainty had disappeared. For the first time, she looked vulnerable, human, almost fragile. For several moments, nobody spoke. Then Brittany looked directly at me and said something I never expected to hear. "I'm sorry." The words hung in the room. Simple, direct, unexpected. I studied her carefully, searching for manipulation, searching for strategy, searching for performance. Maybe some existed, maybe not. But something about her seemed different, tired, defeated, honest. At least more honest than before. Tears appeared in her eyes. Real tears this time, not the carefully timed tears from earlier confrontations. The kind people cry when they're finally exhausted from carrying lies. I don't know when everything got so out of control. The statement sounded sincere, because sometimes people don't become villains overnight. Sometimes they make one bad decision, then another, until eventually they're standing somewhere they never intended to reach. Brittany spoke for nearly 20 minutes. No excuses, no blaming, no accusations, just admissions. Fear, debt, poor decisions, pride, shame, desperation. The story wasn't flattering, but it felt truthful, and truth mattered. When she finally finished, the room fell silent. Then she looked at me. "I know you probably hate me. I thought about that carefully. Then I shook my head. No." Her eyes widened slightly. No, because hate requires energy, and I was done carrying that burden. What I felt was something else. Disappointment, sadness, loss, but not hate. Never hate. As the meeting ended, I realized something important. The battle itself was over. The evidence was clear. The truth was clear. The manipulation had failed. The access was gone. The control was gone. The secrets were exposed. Now only one question remained. Could a family survive what had happened? And for the first time in a very long while, I believed the answer might actually be yes. A month after the meeting in Robert's office, autumn arrived in full force. The maple trees lining my street had turned brilliant shades of red and gold. Leaves drifted across my front yard every morning. The air carried that familiar Ohio chill that always reminded me winter was waiting just around the corner. For the first time in nearly a year, my life felt quiet. Not perfect, not healed, but quiet. The endless phone calls had stopped. The arguments had stopped. The investigations were largely complete. Robert had finalized the legal protections around my assets. Every account was secure. Every property was protected. Every access point had been reviewed and updated. The crisis was over, at least financially. Emotionally was another story. Because while Brittany was no longer controlling the narrative, I still woke up some mornings thinking about Ethan, wondering where I had lost him, wondering whether I could ever fully trust him again, wondering if our relationship would always carry the shadow of what had happened. Then, on a cold Thursday evening, my doorbell rang, and somehow I already knew who it was. When I opened the door, Ethan stood on the porch holding 2 cups of coffee. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he held 1 cup toward me. Peace offering, I looked at the coffee, then at him. The gesture reminded me of his father. Michael used to solve difficult conversations the same way, not with speeches, with coffee, a small olive branch, a simple invitation. I stepped aside. "Come in." We sat in the living room this time, not at the kitchen table. Something about the living room felt less formal, less confrontational. The fireplace crackled softly in the corner. Outside, wind pushed leaves across the driveway. For several minutes, we simply drank coffee. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was cautious, like 2 people approaching a damaged bridge and wondering if it's safe to cross. Eventually, Ethan spoke. "I met with a financial counselor." I nodded. "That's good. I should have done it years ago." "Probably." A small smile appeared. The first genuine smile I'd seen from him in months. Then it disappeared. "I've been learning some uncomfortable things." I wasn't surprised. Pain often becomes the greatest teacher, especially when money is involved. Ethan stared into his coffee. I spent a lot of time blaming Brittany. I remained quiet. I still think she made terrible choices. She did, but that's not the whole story. There it was. Accountability. Real accountability. Not the kind people perform, the kind people earn. He looked at me. I ignored things. I nodded. Yes. I knew things didn't feel right. Yes. I didn't want to see it. That answer hurt, but I respected it, because honesty matters, especially when it costs something. He wasn't minimizing his role anymore. He wasn't hiding behind confusion. He wasn't pretending to be completely innocent. He was finally looking directly at the truth, and truth is where healing begins. Not where healing ends. Where it begins. For a while we talked about practical things. His finances. His plans. The grandchildren. Work. Normal topics. Ordinary topics. Topics families discuss when they're trying to rebuild something fragile. Eventually, however, we both reached the conversation we had been avoiding. The real conversation. The one waiting beneath everything else. "Mom." I looked up. He swallowed hard, then asked, "Can you ever forgive me?" The question hung in the room, heavy, painful, honest. I thought carefully before answering, because forgiveness is a complicated word. People often treat it like a switch. Off. On. Forgiven. Not forgiven. Life rarely works that way, especially after betrayal. I looked at my son, really looked at him. The lines around his eyes, the exhaustion, the regret, the sadness. Then I remembered the little boy who used to hold my hand crossing parking lots, the teenager who left me notes on Mother's Day, the young man who cried at his father's funeral. Those memories still existed. They always would. Finally, I spoke. "I already do." His eyes widened. "You do?" "Yes." The relief that crossed his face was immediate. Then I continued. "But forgiveness isn't the same thing as trust." The relief faded slightly. And again, that mattered. Because healing requires honesty, not comforting lies. "I forgive you." I paused. "But trust has to be rebuilt." He nodded slowly. I understand. And for the first time, I believed he actually did. The old Ethan would have looked for shortcuts, quick fixes, easy solutions. This Ethan looked ready to do the work. That difference mattered. A lot. Later that evening, we discussed something I'd been considering for weeks. My estate plan. The topic immediately made Ethan uncomfortable, which was understandable, given everything that had happened. I don't want your money, Mom. I smiled sadly. I know. And surprisingly, I believe that now. Maybe not before, but now. I need you to understand something. He listened carefully. I spent most of my life thinking love meant giving people access. His expression softened. I continued. Access to my time. Access to my energy. Access to my resources. Access to my trust. The fireplace crackled quietly. I've learned something important. What? I met his eyes. Love without boundaries isn't love. The words seemed to hit him hard, because they had taken me nearly 70 years to learn. I stood and walked toward a nearby cabinet. Inside sat several documents. Updated documents. New documents. The future. I returned and handed them to him. He looked confused. What is this? My revised estate plan? He looked hesitant, then opened the folder. The silence that followed lasted nearly a minute. Finally, he looked up. You changed everything. I nodded. Yes, the inheritance structure had been completely redesigned. Assets were protected through trusts. Distributions were controlled. Oversight mechanisms existed. Safeguards existed. No individual person would ever again have unrestricted access to everything. Not Ethan. Not future spouses. Not anyone. The system protected both the assets and the people involved. Michael would have approved. Actually, Michael probably would have done it years earlier. I smiled at that thought. Ethan closed the folder. Are you worried I'll be upset? The question surprised me. A little. He shook his head, then said something that nearly brought tears to my eyes. I think Dad would have been proud of this. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. Because he was right. Michael would have been proud. Not because I was protecting money, because I was protecting peace. There's a difference, a very important difference. When Ethan left that night, he hugged me. Not a quick, polite hug, a real one. The kind we hadn't shared in a very long time. As I stood on the porch watching him drive away, I felt something unfamiliar. Hope. Not certainty. Not complete healing. Hope. The relationship wasn't fully repaired. Some wounds still needed time. Some trust still needed rebuilding. But for the first time since Brittany called me useless, I could see a future beyond the conflict. A future where my son learned from his mistakes. A future where my grandchildren grew up understanding honesty. A future where love and boundaries could exist together. And perhaps most importantly, a future where I no longer needed anyone's permission to value myself. Because the greatest lesson this entire ordeal taught me was simple. The people who underestimate you are often the people who never took the time to understand you. And I was finally done shrinking myself to make other people comfortable. 6 months later, I was standing in front of a room full of women holding a dry erase marker. If someone had told me a year earlier that this would become one of the happiest moments of my life, I wouldn't have believed them. Yet there I was, smiling, laughing, teaching, living, not surviving, living. The room belonged to a community center in Columbus. Every Wednesday afternoon, I taught free financial literacy classes for older women, widows, retirees, grandmothers, women rebuilding their lives after divorce, women trying to understand investments, women afraid of making mistakes, women who had spent decades caring for everyone except themselves. In many ways, I saw pieces of myself in each of them, and somehow, helping them helped me too. "Never sign a document you don't understand," I said. The room chuckled. One woman raised her hand. "Sounds like that lesson came from experience." The laughter grew louder. I laughed too. If only you knew. The truth was, they did know. At least parts of it. Not every detail, but enough. Enough to understand why I felt so strongly about protecting yourself. Enough to understand why boundaries matter. Enough to understand why age should never become an excuse for surrendering control over your own life. When class ended, several women stayed behind to ask questions. One wanted help reviewing insurance paperwork. Another needed advice regarding retirement planning. A third simply wanted reassurance that she wasn't too old to learn something new. I spent nearly an hour talking with them. When I finally walked outside, the spring air felt warm against my face. For a moment, I stood quietly beside my car, thinking, reflecting, feeling grateful, not because the past year had been easy, because it had changed me. The healing hadn't happened overnight. Nothing meaningful ever does. The first few months after everything collapsed were difficult. There were legal meetings, family conversations, awkward holidays, painful adjustments. The grandchildren struggled to understand why Brittany no longer lived at home. Ethan struggled with guilt. I struggled with trust. Everyone carried something. Everyone had wounds. But slowly, things improved. Not perfectly. Real life rarely offers perfect endings. But honestly, and sometimes honesty is better than perfection, Ethan committed himself to rebuilding his life. Not just financially, emotionally. He attended counseling, met regularly with financial advisors, learned how to manage money independently. Perhaps most importantly, he learned how to ask difficult questions. The old Ethan avoided conflict. The new Ethan understood that avoiding conflict often creates larger problems later. I was proud of him. Not because he became flawless, because he became accountable. There's a difference, a very important difference. My relationship with Brittany never returned to what it once was. How could it? Some bridges cannot be rebuilt exactly as they were. But something surprising happened. About 4 months after our final meeting, I received a letter. Not an email, not a text. An actual handwritten letter. From Brittany. I almost didn't open it. Almost. Curiosity eventually won. The letter wasn't dramatic. It wasn't manipulative. It wasn't filled with excuses. Instead, it contained something I hadn't expected: responsibility. She admitted she had spent years chasing appearances, trying to create a life she couldn't afford, trying to impress people, trying to look successful, trying to outrun insecurities she never addressed. Debt became secrecy. Secrecy became dishonesty. Dishonesty became manipulation. And manipulation nearly destroyed everything. She apologized again, not asking for forgiveness, not asking for another chance. Simply apologizing. At the end of the letter, she wrote something that stayed with me. "You were never the obstacle. My own choices were. I read that sentence several times. Then I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. Not because everything was fixed, because growth deserves acknowledgement. Even when it arrives late. I never responded. But I hoped she meant every word, for her sake as much as anyone else's. One Saturday afternoon, Ethan and the grandchildren came over for lunch. A simple lunch. Nothing special. Sandwiches, potato salad, lemonade. The kind of ordinary family afternoon that once felt impossible. After eating, my granddaughter followed me into the garden. She was 10 years old now. Smart, observant, far too much like me. We spent several minutes planting flowers together. Then she suddenly asked, "Grandma." "Yes." "Why do people think older people don't know things?" The question caught me completely off guard. I smiled. "That's a pretty big question." She shrugged. "I hear it sometimes." I sat back on my heels. Considering my answer, children deserve honesty. Age, appropriate honesty. But honesty. Finally, I said, "Some people confuse age with weakness." She frowned. "Is that true?" "No." The answer came immediately. Absolutely immediately. "No." She smiled, satisfied, then returned to planting flowers. As I watched her work, I felt something shift inside me, a realization. The entire experience had never really been about money. Not entirely. The money mattered. The accounts mattered. The property mattered. But beneath all of that existed something larger. Respect, dignity, value. The assumption that older people become less capable simply because they've accumulated birthdays. That assumption had fueled much of Brittany's behavior, perhaps without her even realizing it. She saw age. She assumed weakness. She saw gray hair. She assumed dependence. She saw a widow. She assumed vulnerability. What she failed to see was experience, wisdom, discipline, strength, the very qualities that ultimately stopped her. Later that evening, after everyone left, I sat alone on my back porch. The sun slowly disappeared beyond the trees. Birds settled into the branches. The world felt peaceful. For the first time in a very long while, I wasn't thinking about legal documents, or account security, or family conflict. I was simply enjoying the moment. My phone buzzed. A text from Ethan. "Thank you for not giving up on me." I stared at the message, then smiled. A few seconds later, I replied, "Thank you for giving me a reason not to." The response came almost immediately. "Love you, Mom." Tears filled my eyes. Not sad tears. Healing tears. The kind that arrive when something broken finally begins to mend. I typed 3 words. "Love you too." Then I put my phone away and looked toward the horizon. The funny thing about being called useless is that the word only has power if you believe it. For a little while, Brittany's words hurt. Deeply. But eventually I realized something. My value was never determined by her opinion, or anyone else's. My value came from the life I built, the family I loved, the wisdom I earned, the resilience I developed, the integrity I protected. And in the end, the woman Brittany dismissed as useless turned out to be the only person paying enough attention to save an entire family from financial disaster. Maybe that was the final lesson. People who underestimate you often reveal far more about themselves than they do about you. And sometimes the greatest victory isn't proving someone wrong. It's continuing to live well after they do. Life has a way of teaching us lessons when we least expect them. One of the most important lessons I learned is that growing older does not make a person less valuable. Age is not a weakness. Age is experience. It is wisdom earned through mistakes, sacrifices, victories, losses, and countless moments that shape who we become. Too often, society treats older people as though they should step aside and surrender control. But protecting your dignity, your finances, your future, and your independence is not selfish. It is necessary. Another lesson is that kindness should never be confused with weakness. For many years, I helped my family because I loved them. I gave without keeping score. I trusted because I wanted the people I loved to succeed. There is nothing wrong with generosity. But generosity without boundaries can sometimes invite people to take more than they should. Trust is precious. And trust should always be accompanied by wisdom. Money itself is not the root of every problem, but money often reveals what is already hidden inside people. It exposes character. It reveals priorities. It magnifies both integrity and selfishness. Most importantly, I learned that forgiveness and trust are not the same thing. You can forgive someone and still require accountability. You can love someone and still establish boundaries. You can move forward without forgetting the lessons that brought you there. If my story touched you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever been underestimated because of your age? Have you ever had to set difficult boundaries with family members? What would you have done in my situation? Please share your experience in the comments. Your story may help someone else feel less alone. And if you enjoy emotional family stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join our community. Also, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are right now. I always love seeing how many wonderful people from around the world are listening.